Okay, welcome to this video where I'm going to explain some of the changes that are going to be in the next version of Fircomp 2. I have been working on other projects, but for the last few weeks I've come back to Fircomp 2 just to make some small improvements and add some features that people have requested. The first and most important improvement that I'm going to be making will be how the feedback works when you are in VCA mode. This will only affect the VCA mode as the peak modes do not have any feedback, they are only in feed-forward mode. This will also not break compatibility with existing projects or presets, as Fircomp 2 will load in legacy VCA mode if VCA mode was enabled in an existing project or preset. As we can see here, the VCA mode says VCA mode legacy. In the old or legacy implementation of VCA feedback, changing the feedback percentage changes the effective ratio, as we can see here, and I will demonstrate this in a moment. This only applies to the VCA mode with feedback, not either of the standard peak modes. This isn't a necessarily wrong implementation, as it's similar to how analog compressors use variable feedback amounts to change the desired ratio. So, as you can see here, I'm in VCA mode legacy with feedback off and a ratio of 4. If I click on this, it says current effective ratio 4. If I adjust the feedback, you will see in Plugin Doctor, which is a great piece of software by DDMF, so that's fantastic, that the effective ratio is changing as I change the feedback amount. And here it now says effective ratio 3 point something. If I turn feedback off, the effective ratio is 4. If I turn it up, the ratio becomes lower. However, in the new version, the feedback control will not affect the effective ratio. Internally, it will work the same way by scaling the feedback amount in dB or in the log domain, because the way it works is it's only the current gain reduction amount in dB that gets fed back, not the entire signal or the output. The new implementation will still be altering the feedback amount, but as a proportion of the amount of feedback required to achieve the desired ratio. So in the new version, your chosen feedback amount will now be a proportion of the feedback required in combination with some other ratio, which is all calculated behind the scenes to achieve the desired ratio that you actually want. Sorry if that sounds really complicated, but let's click on Convert to Improved VCA Mode, which will be the new default, so you won't have to do this on new instances of the plugin. And you can see now that we're now just in normal VCA mode, and the ratio is 1.95. And if I change the feedback amount, the effective ratio does not change at all. Only changing the actual ratio changes the ratio. When you're in the new VCA mode, if you choose a ratio of infinity, feedback will always be off because it's not possible in any compressor to have infinity ratio with feedback. Whereas if in the legacy VCA mode, infinity would give you the internal ratio of infinity, and feedback would then affect the ratio to some extent, which is why you weren't able to use the legacy VCA mode with the limiter in the past. If we convert to improved VCA mode, we now get our ratio of 4, which was the closest ratio to infinity and that amount of feedback. And changing the feedback does not affect the ratio. And I think this may have been why VCA mode got some mixed feedback with it not quite sounding right. So that's the new feedback mode. But it won't break backwards compatibility in existing projects. And if you really want, you can go back to the legacy VCA mode. So yeah, that's going to be the biggest change and the biggest improvement. The next big improvement is that there used to be a crush filter button here, and that's been removed and it's been replaced with sidechain options. So this sidechain options is a new pop-up menu, and it has 3 modes for sidechain filter and 3 modes for detector, and I'm going to go into detector later on. We have high pass filter, which is obviously the default and is not new. We also have this what appears to be a new option, but is in fact not a new option. And it's called high pass, low Q with K shelf. And this is what used to be called the crush filter. And I think the name crush filter was too confusing because some people thought it added distortion or something like that. It was called crush because it was designed to keep the perceived loudness at exactly the same level as in crushing something. Like it crushing a car and making it perfectly square. But now I've given it, because there's more space in the pop-up menu, I've just simply renamed it what it really is. And that is a high-pass filter where it's not like the Butterworth high-pass filter. It has a lower Q, so it's gentler. And there's a K shelf, which is a shelf boost, shelf EQ boost. And again, this is in the side chain, not in what you actually hear in the audio path. And this shelf boost is in the upper mid-range. And it just means that the compressor responds much more closely to volume to how the human ear does. And finally, this is the new mode, and this is bandpass mode. And it's a bandpass filter. It has the same range as the high-pass filter, but it's a bandpass filter. I haven't added a Q control because the more resonant it becomes, the more different the timing is likely to be with very fast attack times. But that might come in future, and a low-pass filter, additional low-pass filter may come in future. And of course, with external sidechain, you can use whatever EQ plugin device that you have available if you wish, but this is just more convenient. And then finally, we have detector mode. So Fircomp has a peak envelope detector implementation, which is very different and very unique compared to any other compressor, analog or digital. It smooths out incoming peaks for the sidechain detector. Obviously, it doesn't do anything to the audible path in order to reduce amplitude modulation and reduce distortion when compression happens. And this peak envelope detector is always at least as high as the incoming signal. So it's what enables Fircomp to simultaneously be a limiter and also have lower distortion. So under the new sidechain options filter, we have the default detector mode, which is Fircomp 2. And if we put a sine wave through this, we can see when we're doing some compression, this is the distortion profile that we get for a 1 kHz sine wave, which is not the most useful way of measuring it. We'll look at other ways of measuring it too. But because people have requested it, I've also put the Fircomp 1 peak envelope detector, which has slightly higher distortion. Whoops. So that's 1, that's 2, that's 1, that's 2, that's 1. And there is also a new naive mode, which I've also called aliasing in brackets, which makes the peak envelope detector simply be the absolute value of the input, which is very, very simple. And that gives you a lot more distortion and hence aliasing. With moderate attack and release times, it's not as big of an issue or as big of a difference. But when we set the attack time to 0 samples, we see in the naive mode, we get quite a lot of distortion. Well, we're at minus 75 dBFS distortion, and we get some aliasing. When we go to, I accidentally pressed the wrong button there. When we go to Fircomp 1, we see that the distortion becomes very low, even with a 0 samples attack time and no look ahead. And when we go to Fircomp 2, it becomes slightly lower. So yeah, that gives you some more creative options. We can also view this instead of a 1 kHz sine wave. We can look at this as a sweep. Plugin Doctor gives us a sweep. For some reason, this sweep stops directly at kind of around 8 kHz or so. I'm not sure how to get it to go all the way up. So the fact that it drops off here is potentially slightly wrong. This is the Fircomp 2 total harmonic distortion. Of course, so in all compressors, the low frequencies get distorted the most. This is the Fircomp 1 total harmonic distortion. As it redraws, you'll see that it's slightly higher. And this is the naive mode total harmonic distortion. And again, I don't know why this fall off is here. It should actually continue higher. So I think this is just me not knowing how to change the length of the sine sweep. but you get what I mean. I've tried to add these new features without making the GUI any more complicated. There may be some other stuff in future. For example, the limit button, which is not a parameter, it's a meta parameter that changes other parameters to make Fircomp 2 into a limiter. Some people have found that confusing, especially when you enable limiting and then click on it again to get back to previous values. I might remove that and replace it with a limit indicator that shows you whether you're limiting or not, and then maybe into some other menu allows you to change parameters to limit and makes it clear that you're changing other parameters rather than this being a parameter in its own right. And I may also add an option to multiply attack times to be much, much slower, or release times to be much, much slower, because that is a feature that some people have requested, is extremely slow attack and release times. I will also be, next year, I will be announcing 2 plugins that will probably be coming out next year. I've mostly been working on code that allows me to write cross-platform Neon or SSE code more easily, working on a library that will enable me to do that. So in summary, this is going to be a new version of Fircomp 2. I'm probably going to call it 2.1. When I make it available, because there's so many small changes, there's going to be potentially some small quirks or bugs that will need to be fixed. And so I will be leaving the previous version still available for download to those who've purchased it, probably for quite a long time, while we kind of work through and check that it's nice and stable, because the previous version, the previous release, has been shown to be very stable, and I want this one to be as stable. So yeah, that's everything I have to say. Thanks for watching, and I'm aiming to put this out probably in about a week or several days, but we'll see. Any new version will be emailed to customers and also posted on my official Twitter. Thanks for watching.